Hey guys, what's up? My name is Leif and I want to welcome you to Boxes of Shame, where I each week try to fight the Grey War and paint up a miniature for Dungeons and Dragons. Jacob M., a viewer, asked me if I could paint up Nolzur's Displacer Beast. Lucky for all of us, I had one of these in my Boxes of Shame. Alright, let's move over to the workbench and have a look at how I painted up this little bad boy.
A couple of years ago I started getting into D&D. As my passion for D&D grew, so did my collection of minis, and like many others out there, I now have Boxes of Shame. This is me painting every single one of my miniatures.
Alright good folks, this is the Displacer Beast from Wizkids and their Nolzur's Marvelous Miniatures line. Once removed from the packaging, I could see that there were some fierce mold lines and that some of the tentacles were a bit warped, so I threw it in the sonic cleaner for a couple of cycles. Now the process heats up the miniature enough for me to set the tentacle in a better angle. For the basing, I went with some pine bark. I wanted to create sort of an overhang similar to how I created the base for the griffin a while back. Getting this attached was easy with some superglue and activated to create an instant bond. Now getting the actual miniature attached to the pine bark, that was trickier, but I put some superglue on the pine bark and then some activator on the miniature, and that seemed to work fine. Now the Displacer Beast had a crack in its, backside, and I decided to use some Vallejo plastic putty, which I spread out using some sculpting tools. Once I'd covered every crack, I took a wet wipe and just wiped off the excess. It's looking good so far. Now the next step was to address the seam line between the miniature's base and the pine bark. I used some white glue and my good old grout mixture, covering the seams and basically the bottom of the black base. Now one thing to note is that I did hand place some larger decorative rocks where the seams were the worst. As usual, I cover all of this with some diluted white glue to lock everything into place. And this is what it looks like when it's dried, and here after a coat of Chaos Black Primer from Citadel. So at this point, I was somewhat happy with the result I had achieved so far. Now what I wanted to try to emulate at this point was some sort of softer highlights, sort of reminiscent of a panther-like fur. Now I could of course build up the layers from the darkest color up until the sort of, mid-tones and then the highlights. But I honestly felt like, okay, I've done that and it's fine. I wanted to sort of try something new. I wanted to think more about the undercoating. And what that meant for me was it was time to go to the airbrush booth and see what I could do there. And I welcome this in so many ways because I haven't nearly had enough practice with the airbrush, so I have a lot to learn there. So I started out with the Liquitex Titanium White, which is an opaque paint. This is by far the best way to create a zenithal effect on the miniatures. So far so good, right? Well, this is where I feel like my inexperience with underpainting and undercoating sort of shines through. No pun intended. I mixed up some Prussian blue and phthalocyanine blue-green shade. Then I added some phthalocyanine green-blue shade, which I sprayed from below, trying to make the shadows more sort of green. Then for some reason, which I don't fully understand, I also sprayed it from above, which I then sprayed over with some grey ink and finally a little bit of white. So this is what it looks like after the airbrushing. Now, learning from past mistakes, I made sure to cover this with a matte varnish before starting to paint with a brush, just to make sure that I don't rehydrate the inks. I started out by adding some Cantor blue and heavy charcoal to the wet palette. I start to glaze in some blue into the model. At this point I leave it quite runny since I want to tint basically the entire model, cracks and crevices included. I add some Screamer Pink and Rin Flesh to the palette, which I will use on some of the, well, fleshier bits. In this case, I start with the ears. I start with more red pink and I start to define the base color. Then I wet blend in some Rin Flesh on the tips of the ears. Then I come in with some cold gray from Vallejo, which I mix with some of the Cantor blue to get a nice highlight color. I add this all over the mini where I think the highlights should be. I add some Vallejo Dead White to the palette with some flow improver. Now I just take my time nice and slowly and I try to paint in those eyes. At this point I thought that I might as well start putting some white on the teeth. Please don't do this unless you're looking to make the miniature look like it has a perfect $10,000 smile. I added some Screamer Pink onto the tongue and into the mouth of a Displacer Beast. I did the same on the fleshy bits of the tentacles. In both cases I diluted the paint somewhat to make it run into all of the details. At this point, the white in the eyes had dried, so I came in with some yellow ink. Now the reason why I'm doing this is because white paint covers much better than any yellow I have. It's not a must, but I wanted the eyes to really be intense yellow. I add some Jackbone and Minoff white highlight to the palette. My goal is to use this on the teeth of the tentacles, and of course, repainting those teeth in the Displacer Beast's mouth. And I want to break in here for a second. My job here was to partly make the miniature look good, of course. But honestly, I was more intrigued by the base. I wanted to make it feel as if we viewers get a small glimpse into this ferocious feline's world as a top predator. So that meant that I had to pretty much bring out all of the tools and tips and tricks that I had acquired so far in my arsenal to try to realize that vision. Let's see how that process went. So I start with some diluted umbral umber and cover the entire base. The good thing with the thinned out layer is that we're essentially tinting the green-blue undershading with some brown, which I think sells it as a nice sort of dirty rocks, muds, cliffside. After that had dried, I dry brushed on some colors that I had in the palette, starting with some gray first and then some white. I purposefully do not dry brush any highlights under the beast to make that negative space act as a more sort of shadowy area. I covered the flat sides with some superglue and started sprinkling on some coconut fiber. This sort of starts to give the scene some fallen leaves and small roots kind of feel. Now in order to show some scale and push that vegetation further, I brought out some of my dried roots. I used some superglue and tried to attach some small roots to emphasize that overhang, almost looking as the rock has been overgrown with roots searching for good soil. Now let's add some contrasting greenery to the scene. I went with some tufts from Army Painter, which I attached here and there for variation. At this point, it's time to have a look at the final result. I forgot to mention one little detail. One thing that you might have noticed is that I added some pigments to the scene. It really ties everything together. Alrighty, that's all for this week. I want to thank you for staying here and watching this video all to the end. If you like what I'm doing here, then please show my channel some love. Like, share or subscribe. And of course, don't forget that bell icon so you don't miss any of the videos I post. If you have any thoughts, comments or questions, please feel free to post them in the comment section down below. I'll see you in the next video.